Joan lived from 1412 to 1431. This 19-year-old died before she knew the pleasures of having a family of her own or of adult life with her peers. What's interesting is to see how she has lived on with all of us in the Western imagination. I want here to talk very selectively about the impact of Joan over the following 6 centuries after her death of the Western consciousness. Always remembered at Orléans by a solemn festival in her honor on May 8th, Joan was relatively forgotten, even in France, until the 18th century. Several dramatists, including Shakespeare, revived memory of her from the 16th century forward in England, but then in France, in the Enlightenment, we have her mocked, not taken seriously, but by such writers as Voltaire, and then celebrated as a heroine by Schiller and Southey. The 19th century saw the revival of what can only be called the cult of Joan, the Maid of Orléans, not only in France. In France, she became the national heroine of monarchists, of republicans, of socialists, and of conservatives, all across the political spectrum. In the 20th century, Joan was a powerful figure of Allied propaganda during the First World War, and this led to a movement of guilty reparation on the part of many an English person. In World War II, she inspired both Charles de Gaulle and the Vichy propagandists. Today, she is exploited in propaganda, mostly now by right-wing nationalist parties. The Church beatified Joan in 1909 and canonized her, declared her a saint in 1920. As a saint, her cult spread throughout the Catholic world. The international film agencies have also adopted Joan as one of its favorite characters. Films of her have been made in Britain, Germany, Italy, Russia, Japan, and the United States, as well as in other French-speaking countries since the First World War. Joan has become a heroine for feminists, national liberation movements, political prisoners, and amnesty movements. She remains an extraordinary, rule and role-defying figure in human history. When we think of Joan, we think of someone who was famous not just in later times, but even in her own times. The most famous female poet of the later Middle Ages is a woman named Christine de Pizan, who was the court poet in France, although she was herself from a family that was Italian, from Pisa. And she herself, having left the court in the midst of the terrible troubles of the young childhood of Charles, was supposed to be, we think, in monastic retirement until that moment in 1429 when she heard about the Maid capturing the city or relieving the city of Orléans. Christine de Pizan was enormously important not just as a writer of nice poems that could be appreciated for various kinds of events and moments in court, but also because she wrote the best rule of law and war in the Middle Ages in her great Feats of Arms and Chivalry, which was one of the very first books translated into English by William Caxton and printed on English soil. Christine de Pizan was also a participant in something called the Querelle des Femmes, this wonderful quarrel about women, which took place also from the time, and here's a name we will return to, of Jean de Meun in his Romance of the Rose, in which he recollects the story of Abelard and Eloise. In that same huge, long poem, Jean raises the question of whether women are worthy, whether women in any way could be considered the equal of men. And this question was one that was pursued at the University of Paris with some force during Joan's own lifetime. In the Querelle des Femmes, which begins in the 11th and 12th centuries, we find, in Jean de Meun continuing it in around 1285 with 17,000 lines of poetry. We know that by the middle of the 14th century, this which had been a poetic conceit has become an academic debate about the inferiority of women to men. And we find on one side of this question, in Joan's own lifetime, not only the female poet, Christine de Pizan, not just poet, writer, theorist of war, Christine de Pizan, who also wrote a magnificent book called The Book of the City of Ladies. We started with the question, if women had told the story, how would the story have been told? Who painted the lion, as we said, tell me who. What Christine does in her book of The City of Ladies is say, had women built the cities and told the stories, what sort of world would it be? And she invents a whole mythology of a world in which women were the rulers. Interestingly, when she heard about Joan, she may have heard about Joan from Jean Gerson, the great theologian and wonderful diplomat who had been at one point chancellor of the University of Paris until he was despoiled of that position by the English who were overtaking Paris. Interestingly, Jean was insistent that it was going to be the role of the church and of Christine to restore the validity of women in culture. And Christine, when she heard about Joan, probably from Jean, who was then on his deathbed, immediately sat and composed a poem, an extraordinary poem called the Dittier de Jeanne d'Arc, the story of Joan of Arc. I have learned of Esther, Judith, and Deborah, she says, who were women of great worth, through whom God saved his people, who had been sorely oppressed, and of other gallant women, all worthies every one, through whom God performed many miracles, but none through more than the Maid. Interestingly enough, she composed this poem. She says she finished it on the 31st of July of 1429. That is, between the time that Charles was crowned at Reims and the time that Paris failed to fall to Joan. She says, thinking about the honor of Joan and the extraordinary success of Orleans, oh, what an honor for the feminine sex. It is obvious that God loves it, that all those vile people who had laid a whole kingdom to waste, by a woman this realm is now made safe and sound. Something more than 5,000 men could not do it, and those traitors purged forever. Scarcely anyone would have believed in this. And we're told that she is the remedy for France's troubles and made their prophecies foretell that she would carry a banner in all French wars, and also told all she would accomplish and how she would do so. We're told that Christine died shortly after this, and we're told as well, we know that Gerson died in the middle of July of 1431. So we have here a story which is one of a great poet thinking about a long relationship with Jean Gerson, who had himself defended the rights of women, and both of them commenting on the role of the wonderful Joan of Arc at her moment of highest success. This is the first story that we have told by an artist about Joan. But we know that from 1435, in Orleans, Joan's memory has been consistently honored by a festival which is held on the 8th of May. Isn't that amazing? Before Joan was even re-sanctified, I shouldn't say re-sanctified, I should say that before her verdict was nullified in the 1450s, this wonderful play about her was being shown in Orleans. This has been celebrated with dramatic performances as well as processions for something like 5 centuries, barring a few short breaks during periods of extreme political difficulty. The central dramatic performance is a mystery play in medieval style, The Mystery of the Siege of Orleans. It's a verse play of over 20,000 lines with over 100 speaking characters and many more walk-ons. In other words, it's a huge public event that involves much of the city of Orleans in its performance. It was revised around the time of the nullification trial from an earlier text, and to Joan's role was added more of substance about her great virtue and value as a virgin warrior. Numerous comparable but shorter pageant-style dramas about Joan were composed and performed in many countries in the late 19th and 20th centuries, not all of them even by church groups. Some have been featured, as we know, by resorts as spa entertainment. In the early 20th century, the French poet Charles Péguy wrote a major poem, which can be and frequently has been performed as a drama. He was influenced by, but it's very unlike, the Orleans mystery play. Peggy's Mystery of the Charity of Joan of Arc is generally recognized as a monument to a certain kind of Catholic French literature. And those two mysteries sum up much of the continuity and difference between medieval and modern perceptions of Joan. Interestingly enough, however, Most of the writers of the late 16th and 17th century who wrote about Joan were dramatists. That changed during the Enlightenment. Shakespeare, always a patriotic Englishman, said nasty things about Joan as the whore of the Armagnacs in Henry VI, Part 1, one of his least sympathetic female figures, who in fact tries to keep herself from being burned at the stake by claiming that she's pregnant, so that at least they have to wait. And we have all of these sort of miserable, awful English stories about Joan at that time. Several Francophone dramatists wrote supportive and successful plays about the Maid in the 17th century. Vivry de Garvier's La Tragédie de Jeanne d'Arc was a great stage success in Rouen in Paris between 1600 and 1611, during the reign of another popular French hero, Henry IV. And the text of that was republished at least 8 times after that. Vivry's success was followed up by Nicolas Chrétien, Nicolas Verluth in Latin, a story in 1629, by the Abbé d'Aubillac, a medical doctor, and by the academician Le Monnier in 1642, an early feminist Précieuse, Madame de Scudéry, and other less famous figures all invoked the image of Joan. At least 8 plays about Joan were composed and performed in France during the 18th century. But there were 3 major poetic works for and against Joan that were composed in the 18th century in 3 languages. The great Enlightenment writer, French writer Voltaire, wrote a scurrilous satire called La Pucelle d'Orléans, which was circulated first privately in 1740 and then later formally published in 1762. And later it characterized Joan as a lumpish and stupid peasant who rides an ass, constantly gets surprised while naked, and finally yields her virginity to Dunois. Voltaire was very amused that the French, given their proclivities, would make a national heroine of a virgin, and he therefore sought to undermine the story of Joan's virginity ironically. The Englishman Robert Southey was outraged by that satire and caricature, and he published a long, laudatory epic poem entitled Joan of Arc in 1796, when he was only 22. In 1801, comparably outraged, Friedrich Schiller published his verse drama. Despite their opposition on almost every other point, both Voltaire and Schiller had to get rid of Joan's virginity. It was not acceptable to a medieval European male, and Renaissance or Enlightenment medieval male, that Joan should retain her virginity. It seemed to be a problem for those who knew her in life, as well as those who faced her in death. Most of the plays and non-dramatic poems written about Joan from the 17th through the 19th century also ended with Joan's deflowering. Her virginity, which was the guarantee of the authenticity of her mission in the medieval mind, was too much for those modern male authors. The 19th century saw the revival of what can only be called the cult of Joan the Maid, and not only in France. In France, she became the nationalist heroine of monarchists and republicans, of socialists as well as conservatives. Much of the credit for this all-embracing cult must go to the mid-19th century historian Jules Michelet, a Republican, working-class utopian socialist, at one time of his life devoutly Catholic, and then the opposite. But he was always wildly enthusiastic about Joan of Arc. Let's hear what he says about her. Joan's eminent originality was her common sense. This sets her apart from the multitude of enthusiasts who in ages of ignorance have swayed the masses. In most cases, they derived their power from some dark, contagious force of unreason. Her influence, on the contrary, was due in the clear light that she was able to throw on an obscure situation, through the unique virtue of her own good sense and her own loving heart. The shrewd and the cautious, the men of little faith, could not unravel the knot. She cut it. She declared in the name of God that Charles VII was the rightful heir. He himself doubted his legitimacy. She reassured him. She secured for that legitimacy the sanction of heaven by leading her king straight to Reims, and through her swift action, she won over the English the decisive advantage of the coronation. And he reminds us of that fact which we must always be reminded of. Not only that she brought Charles to Reims for his coronation, but that he was crowned first. That Henry the Boy King did not come to Paris to be crowned until after Charles had already been crowned. It's also true that Michelet gives us a slightly different view of the English here. The people of England, with its greatness and in many good and solid virtues, suffers from a vice which spoils these very virtues. This vice, boundless and profound, is pride, a cruel disease which is nothing, nevertheless, but their principle of life, the key to their antinomies, the secret of their actions. With them, virtues and vices are invariably founded upon pride, and their ludicrous aspects have the same origin. Their pride is prodigiously sensitive and painful. It causes them to suffer intensely, and they take further pride in concealing their suffering. However, the suffering does break out. The English language has two expressive words of its own, which the French have borrowed: disappointment and mortification. This ego worship, this inner cult of the creature for its own sense, such is the sin which caused the downfall of Satan, the supreme defiance of God. With so many virtues on the human plane, with their high seriousness, with their dignified bearing, with their biblical turn of mind, no people stands farther away from grace than do the English. From Shakespeare to Milton, from Milton to Byron, their literature, with its somber beauty, is skeptical, Judaic, satanic. With regard to the law, a jurist rightly said, the English are Jews, the French are Christians. What he said of the law, a theologian could have said of the faith. The American Indians, who so often reveal penetration and originality, express this distinction in their own way. Christ, said one of them, was a Frenchman whom the English crucified in London. Pontius Pilate was an official in the servant of Great Britain. We see here Michelet representing still the horror of the French at the burning of Joan of Arc by what he thought of as the English. Joan became a potent figure of Allied propaganda, which meant including the English, in World War I. American enthusiasm for her also mounted at that time. She was seen by the French and the English and the Americans at this time as a figure of liberation. In World War II, Joan's example inspired both Charles de Gaulle and Vichy propaganda. Two different sides of the political coin once more claimed her for their inspiration. Today, Joan is exploited as a propaganda figure in France, mostly by rightist parties. Jean-Marie Le Pen, leader of the anti-immigrant National Front political party that was popular in the early part of the third millennium, said she was his special inspiration. Is he and was he trying to copy de Gaulle? From its inception, movies have celebrated Joan, doing less violence to the historical facts of her life. Thomas Edison even made a film about Joan. Some critics think that the finest movie tributes can be found in silent movies, and especially look to The Passion of Joan of Arc, directed by the Danish Carl Dreyer in 1928, with Maria Falconetti playing Joan, who she then retired from the theater. It's a very moving and painful evocation of Joan on trial. But it does not show the other Joans. Joan at war, Joan at prayer, Joan at court. It's extremely difficult for an actress to play the whole role of all of Joan's roles and still be convincing as a girl who was dead by the time she was 19. Cecil B. DeMille had tried his hand at this apparently irresistible theme with the silent movie Joan the Woman, which he made in 1917. Important to remember that it was made before Joan was sanctified, and he based this on Schiller. Geraldine Farrar played Joan. An approved Nazi version of the story was Gustav Ikicki's Das Mädchen Johanna. Charles is the hero of this movie, and Joan's execution is seen as a brilliant strategic move. As Kevin Hardy reminds us, Charles thus rids himself of a rival for national adulation. And then Maxwell Anderson's play, Joan of Lorraine, was adapted for the RKO film Joan of Arc, directed in 1948 by Victor Fleming and starring none other than Ingrid Bergman. We find in that wonderful story the French dramatist poet Paul Claudel's text serving as a basis for the film script. And then there's Otto Preminger's 1957 St. Joan, starring the wide-eyed Gene Seberg, an adaptation by Graham Greene of George Bernard Shaw's 1924 play. Shaw's play was the centerpiece of an apologetic British revision of old attitudes about Joan. In this play, she becomes a proto-Protestant for some, if not for the high-minded church Anglicans who were among her most ardent supporters. And several other British and Irish authors celebrated the maid in different genres. Today, one not infrequently encounters statues and windows of St. Joan of Arc, an Anglican, Episcopalian, and other related Anglophone churches. But that's only one side of the spiritual Joan of Arc we see. The other side is that brought to us by Margaret Murray, the grande dame of British folkloric studies, who argued that, in fact, Joan was a witch, which for Murray was a very good thing. Murray was a great apologist for the witches, the ancient pagan priestesses of Europe. And one strain of Wiccan feminist thought continues this line of argument today and claims Joan as one of its heroes. Have more movies been made worldwide about Joan of Arc than any other character? I think so. 1993 saw the production of an important two-part French movie directed by Jacques Rivette, Jean Le Pucelle. And this is a script that sticks basically to the facts. It does, however, take 6 hours to see both sides. The last years of the old millennium, 1999, was a particularly rich year for films of Joan. CBS produced a miniseries on Joan that May, starring Lily Sobieski. It was very compelling in part because she was filmed in that role when she was 16. In July of 1999, Luc Besson released his The Messenger, Joan of Arc, first in Paris, then in the United States. Bresson's recently estranged wife, Milla Jovovich, played Joan. The rest of the cast included such distinguished actors as John Malkovich, Faye Dunaway, and Dustin Hoffman. This iconoclastic film script pushed to the limits, one might hope, factual deformation of Joan's private story, robbed her of any heroic or mythic stature, although it did project perhaps the most accurate battle scenes seen in any Joan movie. But she herself, as a figure, Joan, if we remember the New York psychiatric hospitals, seemed more like Joan of Bellevue than Joan of Arc. And so it goes. More movies are in the works. More movies always seem to be in the work about Joan. Why does she continue to exercise this fascination? If anything, she has been more important to the imagination of our time than she was to that of her own 15th century. She is an obvious, inevitable hero. Fortunately fading as a narrowly French nationalist heroine, she remains an inspiration for movements of national and economic liberation worldwide. These have been among the most important movements of our time. Umberto Eco, for one instance, called Che Guevara, the Joan of Arc of his moment. She's also a model of political prisoners. There have always been political prisoners, but their plight has become particularly agonizing in our time, especially if the imprisoning power wants ideological capitulation. And she is not just an inspiration to the old, but to the young, to the idealistic, committed young of any time, especially if they are among the socially and politically disadvantaged. The Catholic Church, as I said, finally validated Joan in the early 20th century. She was beatified in Rome in 1909, thus paving the way officially for her to become a saint. In 1920, she was canonized a saint, just after World War I, we might remember, by Pope Benedict XV. Ironically, she was not canonized as a martyr. She was not canonized as a confessor. She was canonized as a virgin. The movement for her canonization had been launched in 1869 by the then Bishop of Orleans, and her cult as a saint has spread throughout the Catholic world. Catherine Ann Porter, the American writer, said of Joan, "All attempts to account rationally for Joan's life end no better than those which try to fit it to some fantastic theory. She is unique. She is a mystery. And as you read about her and think about her life, you are led up to a threshold beyond which she eludes you. You cannot cross it." How then, in the end, do we assess Joan? Can we assess Joan? 2,000 years before we could look to the model of the feminine from Hesiod's Theogony, in which Pandora, since she is woman, is also crime and sin. So too was Eve, the woman as essential temptress. And so too is Joan, whose remarkable story ends in the tragedy of her refusal to submit to her culture's norms and requirements for the feminine. As Marina Warner points out in her book, Joan is a virgin. She has a womb, but she does not want it to be a container for male desires or progeny. She's a virgin who refuses to have acts of sex, but doesn't pretend to be a man. She is most notable for what she is not. She is not a queen. She's not a courtesan. She's not a mother. She's not a beauty. She's not an artist. She's not an intellectual. She belongs to a sphere of action, not of thinking. And she was hated by intellectuals because she did not hold the party line. She is renowned for what she did on her own, not by birthright, not by inheritance, not by marriage. And we see her always represented with a boyish stance, cropped hair, medieval eyes, clothed in armor. In that alone, she is one of the most overrepresented and misunderstood women in history. She's a nationalist, a warrior, and a woman. For Shakespeare, as I said, she was the whore of the Armagnacs, a witch. And nowhere does Shakespeare reveal his horror about or hatred of women more clearly than in his depiction of Joan of Arc. But that is not enough. Every culture has its forbidden topics. In the sophisticated American culture of our day, we can talk easily about politics and sex. We can even talk about power and desire. We feel comfortable talking about Joan as a girl who does not express any sexual desires, nor does she seem to inspire any sexual desire. Was she chaste or repressed? Modern psychologizing interpreters want to see her as physically or sexually repressed. Perhaps she never matured, some say, on the basis of no evidence. Perhaps absence of desire is not repression, even if her cross-dressing judges found that hard to believe, these men who wore skirts. But finally, they accepted her as a virgin. Joan, however, claimed that she shaped her life, her mission, and her goals at the direction of her heavenly voices, the archangels, St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret. Joan, in her own day and in ours, embodies and symbolizes profound religious faith. How has faith been represented, admitted, or denied? The figure of Joan forces us to admit our own embarrassment about matters of faith. It's more troublesome, more shocking than sex and strumpets. Joan's story forces us to think about faith, that most inadmissible of topics. The absence of Joan's desire for anyone other than God challenges our post-Freudian sensibilities. Of course, it also doesn't help that Joan has been evoked in 19th and 20th century politics as the essence of a kind of Aryan rural Christian whose enemy, Cochon the pig, was literally and wrongly constructed as a Jew, an emblem of the city of anti-French nationalist desires. But about faith, certain questions are simple and cannot be answered. Was Joan a fraud? Was she crazy? Or did she hear voices? What are the physics of psychic communication? Did the voices she heard have authority? Were they sent from God? Is there God? Joan speaks of her faith in God. I shall answer you. Regarding the matter of submission to the Church, I have answered you on that point of all the works I have done. Let a report be sent to Rome, to our Holy Father, the Sovereign Pontiff, to whom and to God first of all I appeal. As to my words and deeds, I've done them on God's orders and no one else, and neither my king nor any other. If there is any fault, it is mine and no one else's. That is her faith. About faith and our inability to describe it, this T.S. Eliot says, men's curiosity searches past and future and clings to that dimension. But to apprehend that point of intersection of the timeless with time is the occupation of a saint. No occupation either, but something given and taken in a lifetime's death in love, ardor and selflessness and self-surrender. Stephen Spender may have evoked it for us best in a kind of secular form when he said, and if we can't contend exactly with faith, we are all certainly perceived to train her constancy and honor, her true greatness. He says, I think continually of those who are truly great, who from the womb remembered the soul's history through corridors of light, where hours are sun, endless in singing, whose lovely ambition was that their lips still touched with fire should tell of the spirit, clothed from head to foot in song, and who hoarded from the spring branches the desires falling across their bodies like bosom. What is precious is never to forget the essential delight of the blood drawn from ageless springs, breaking through rocks and worlds before our earth. Never to deny its pleasures in the morning, simple light, nor its grave evening demands for love. Never to allow the traffic to smother with noise and fog the flowering of the spirit. Near the snow, near the sun, in the highest fields, see how these names are fetid by the waving grass and by the streamers of white cloud and whispers of wind in the listening sky, the names of those who in their life fought for life, who wore at their hearts the fire's center. But born of the sun, they traveled a short while towards the sun and left the vivid air signed with their honor.